All right, everyone. So we're going to start. I will say this is a little bit weird, not being able to hear how loud I am. So if you want me to be louder, you can tell me to go louder, okay? Awesome. So today I want to talk about how I can use my anxiety disorder and how you guys can use whatever anxiety you have in your lives to better improve your penetration testing abilities and basically get crits on pen tests and bug bounties. If my computer wants to listen to me. Okay. So although we are going to be focusing on informal threat modeling, I want to review what formal threat modeling looks like so that we can have a basis to know where we're coming from. And then we're going to look at case studies to see how we can actually leverage informal threat modeling to actively benefit penetration tests, and then review some high-level guidance. So a quick about me. I am an offensive security consultant at Bishop Fox. Basically, I do pen tests specifically on web applications. My passion is in threat modeling and architecture security assessments. My past experience is in GRC and incident response, so blue team stuff. And in high school, I was focused mainly on quantum physics and radio astronomy. I am currently a sitting member of the OWASP ASVS working group, so that's the Application Security Verification Standard. OWASP is a vendor sponsor this year. Say hi to them, they're awesome. It's the open, I think they changed their name from Open Web App to Open Worldwide Application Security Project. They're an open source project, highly recommend, they're awesome. And I am based in New Jersey, which means I have to pay $5 to leave the state and come over here. My favorite bridge is the Ben Franklin. I will slander the Walt Whitman Bridge, although I do have to take it to get to the airport. And my superpower, though I've been getting better about it, is worrying. It might be like cultural, it might be genetic. Both my parents have anxiety, but that makes me particularly skilled at identifying threats. So to start with formal threat modeling, we're going to look at the 4 questions framework. This was developed by Adam Shostak during his time at Microsoft, and he is also one of the leading authors of the Threat Modeling Manifesto, another project released by OWASP. And these 4 questions kind of talk about the formal threat modeling process. So we start off with what are we working on, which we want to establish the scope and have us understand what it is that we're actually looking at. So we do this by creating a data flow diagram. This is just a diagram that shows all of the components in a web application, or depending on what your target is, it might be a piece of hardware or whatever, and you're gonna see how data flows through each of those components. And importantly, you're going to draw the trust zones and the trust boundaries within those. The trust zones is an area where you have one level of trust. That's going to be an internal network, for example. And the trust boundary is where you are shifting from trust zones, right? So if you're going from the public internet to a web server, there's a trust boundary there. And when you're doing traditional threat modeling, your threats are really going to be focused in that trust zone, where I'm going from one trust zone to the other at that trust boundary. That's where my threats are going to be. My next step is what can go wrong. And this is my favorite part, where we enumerate all the threats against the application or at each trust boundary. Now, traditionally we use the STRIDE framework to be able to identify these threats, where STRIDE is an acronym for spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privilege. However, there are other frameworks for identifying these threats. There's Linden, which is privacy-oriented. There are other frameworks, but STRIDE is the most popular and was also developed at Microsoft in the 90s by Shostak, Brooke Schoenfeld. So that's the most popular one that you'll hear associated with formal threat modeling. Our next step is what are we going to do about it? Basically, how do we fix it? This is our threat. How do we prevent it from happening? So here it's for each threat, we're going to identify the mitigations. What are the controls that we put in place to prevent this threat from happening? And finally, did we do a good enough job? So this step is kind of weird and may not make sense initially. But when we consider in today's agile environment that we're constantly developing an application, we want to make sure that our work the first time is good and useful enough such that we will do it again during the next rotation. Because a threat model should never be, a formal threat model should never be one time. You want to be maintaining it as you're developing the application, because if you only do it at the start, it's not going to grow with you, and you're not going to address any threats that may start to come up as you're adding functionality to your application or to your system. Now, as I mentioned, I work for a consulting company. So when I do threat modeling, our 4 steps become 7. And that's because we're coming from outside. We don't have the same knowledge as the developers themselves, who would traditionally be the ones participating in a threat model, which we also call whiteboard hacking, because usually, everyone sits in a room and they're talking about the system on a whiteboard. We don't have that knowledge. We are not the developers of the application. We are not the engineers. We are not the stakeholders. And so we come in and we spend a lot of time interviewing the developers, talking to them, understanding what are the business's concerns, what are their trophy targets, what are the attacks and threats that they are concerned about or have already faced. And so this takes a little bit more time in the what are we working on side. So now that we have a decent understanding of what formal threat modeling looks like, we can talk about informal threat modeling. Now, whether or not we realize it, most of us threat model every day. We may not consciously know that we're doing it, or we may not know there's a name for it. Seasoned penetration testers and other offensive security folks will threat model a target, whether consciously or unconsciously, at the beginning of an assessment, and I want to show you how to consciously make it part of your practice. As someone who is perpetually anxious, I threat model all sorts of situations in my life, but without placing reasonable limitations, these situations can snowball very quickly. And so, really, informal threat modeling is based on a single question. What could go wrong? But if you ask just what can go wrong, you will be listing, I will be listing situations forever. So we have an asterisk, because the question comes with this caveat. What could go wrong that I or someone else, like a client, actually cares about? So in short, context is everything. Without context, we can end up with an infinite list of all of the ways something can go wrong, a lot of which aren't really a huge deal. In a formal threat model, we explore a lot of the possible threats, but we really only deep dive and propose mitigations for the credible and top threats. So what does it mean for something to be credible? It's feasible for the situation, and that's going to change from scenario to scenario, because feasibility is really linked to effort and expertise required when we're talking about threats being exploited, right? And so if I'm Etsy, let's say, I assume most people are familiar with online craft marketplace, really awesome, order most of my holiday gifts from there. If I'm Etsy, I'm not super worried about nation state actors, right? Like, yeah, I have credit card information, but like not really much other sensitive information, right? But if I'm a platform like SolarWinds that offers services to government organizations, I should be concerned about threat actors. And within formal threat modeling, this is actually something we can take into account, because when we're doing risk severity calculations, we actually assess what are the threat actors that we're concerned about, what is their level of expertise, what is their level of access, And we also look at what is the impact. So not only impact to your CIA triad, to confidentiality, integrity, and accessibility, but also to the business. What is the impact to the reputation of the business? What is a financial impact for if they need to stop operations? So these top incredible threats are typically determined by the client's primary concern, or if you're a pen tester, you might talk about a trophy target. So for example, if I'm working on a medical application, I know it probably has PHI, the personal health information, which is protected by HIPAA. So I want to figure out all the ways that I can get PHI. That might be through SQL injection. That might be through, escalating my account privileges to that of a doctor, right? What I'm focusing on is dependent on the application of what it is that it's protecting. And any finding has to be taken within the context of that client situation, because those use cases can differ. For example, I was recently doing a pen test on a web application that was using a really weak algorithm to generate this pseudo-random string that it was using to title documents that were externally available and had risk assessments for a bunch of companies. And so we found the documents and we're like, oh, this is really weak, we can break it. And we generated a list of here's a bunch of other documents that using the algorithm that you used exist. And we showed them, hey, we got all of this. And they're like, okay, cool, but we don't really care. And it was true, they didn't really care. They used that algorithm because they could, and there was really no reason for it to be a pseudo-random string. And so what we could otherwise report as weak cryptographic algorithm didn't really matter to this client. So for the rest of the talk, I want to discuss specific case studies. Specifically how we can level up pen test skills using threat modeling to prioritize your test cases, know which rabbit holes are actually worth diving into, identifying pivot or escalation points, and understanding the true impact of a finding. Depending how we are with time, I also want to discuss a case study where we can use threat modeling to identify effective controls. So our first case study, who here, with a show of hands, thinks that it's a problem if I can figure out if a given person is registered on a website? Okay, so about half. In my own methodology for pen testing and that of my organization, one of the things we test for is user enumeration. Basically, can I tell if a given user is, if a given email or given person is a user of this website? And typically, this is something that is pretty low priority on our list. It's also really easy to test for usually. The first place to go is reset password functionality. I forgot my password, and usually there will be a difference in what it tells you. It'll be oh, hey, we sent you an email, or you don't have an account here. Sometimes the difference will maybe be time-based in how long it sends you an error. Anyway, this is typically low priority, right? Everyone has a Gmail account. It's not sensitive if I have a Gmail account. But what if it's a different website that's more sensitive? If I have an account, let's say, and I don't, on Ashley Madison, what does that say about me? That I have an account on this website? Now, if someone can figure out that I, Shanni Prutchi, right, because with user enumeration, we're not necessarily dumping the database of all the users. We are saying, can I find out if an individual person has an account on this site? If you can say, I, Shanni Prutchi, have an account on Ashley Madison, that could be an issue. You can blackmail me, and that becomes a security problem, right? Because, hey, if you don't do this thing, if you don't give me creds at your company, if you don't, open a shelf for me somewhere, I will tell your spouse, I will tell your employer about this. Now, this can even get into legal issues, because in some states, when I have to make an appointment with my doctor, I can log in and make an appointment for my OBGYN. Let's say I have an online account with a provider that is known for providing abortion services. If I'm in Texas, maybe the fact that I even have an account on that site could be used against me in a court of law. Now, I don't know this, don't take this from me as legal advice, but obviously there are cases where something that is typically a low priority test case automatically becomes one of the top concerns in my list. So we can see that this test case that usually isn't a cause for concern is now going to be a big deal. My next case study is when we have a really big application or something with some really deep functionality, and we want to know which rabbit holes are worth exploring. Because during a test, you'll jump down some rabbit holes, and I frequently, after about 3 hours down a rabbit hole, I start to ask myself, okay, like, am I just wasting time at this point? Or like, do I dig a little bit deeper to find something? Or like, should I cut my losses? And here, this is where you can really use this to figure out, like, where can I spend my rabbit hole time? So in this case, I was looking at an endpoint detection and response tool that has like hosts, that has endpoints, like agents on hosts, but like everything is in the cloud to manage it. You can talk directly to the hosts, you can investigate alerts and keep notes on it, and you can also look at historical data. So like a ton of functionality that's really interesting, like maybe see if I can do something on my endpoints that have agents on it. So now I have to think about what are the underlying infrastructure, right? Because every application is not just some code hanging out, right? There's stuff that actually supports it. There's a web server. If it's storing data, there's a database. Think about what other infrastructure may exist behind that. So here I have my agent so that I can get live data. I have a server running this cloud app, and I have a database that is storing the historical data because it doesn't want to query the hosts every time you're pulling historical data. And so in this case, I said, well, there's a database to store the data, and I can like directly send it queries. I wonder if I can get not just historical data, because databases have schema. And I wonder if that schema can tell me stuff about other tenants of this cloud. Because we know that SQL databases have an information schema table that is by default. And look at that, we can see the other customers. And so this is something that you wouldn't necessarily think to do if you're not thinking about the infrastructure, right? And so you want to see, you want to take a second to step aside, and once you're in that rabbit hole where you are, looking for SQL injection or looking for cross-site scripting or code injection, you want to know, is this worth it? Like, am I attacking something that is there? And the way that you can get this information is through the stuff that we normally don't put a lot of weight into, right? Banner information disclosure, error messages, love a good error message. Like a stack trace, perfect. Because if I know that like, hey, I'm using a serialization library, perfect. The more information about what's going on in the background, the better. Our third case, knowing when to pivot or when to escalate. This is going to happen where you may have a lot wider of a scope, or you may need to ask about extending your scope in the case of web applications. And here I want to talk about some internal tooling. Believe it or not, companies sometimes do care about the security of their internal tooling. I like it when they do, but usually the internal tooling does not have as many security controls as otherwise because they're viewing their employees as more trusted than an external user. And when everyone is a trusted actor, there's going to be fewer protections. And so that's already an awesome place to begin with. The next thing I want you to ask is where might these resources be shared? Because companies want to be resourceful. And the fewer new services we need to spin up, the better. Can the credentials or tokens that are used for my internal tool, are they used somewhere else? If my internal tool is generating tokens to access a database, are those tokens used for another database maybe? They might be. We also want to consider privilege escalation, because scope creep, privilege creep is gonna happen. A user's there for 10 years, an employee's there for 10 years, their positions change. And people are really bad at controlling privileges, making sure you have least privilege, but also if you get new privileges, that whatever old privileges you have that are no longer necessary have been removed. And of course, legacy systems are your friend. While a lot of companies may make sure that their external facing systems are up to date, are patched, internal is not as much of a concern. It's not as a high priority. And our last is looking at calculating the severity. And this is one of the case studies that I actually find most interesting. As you can tell, I have feelings about NFTs. I have this bumper sticker on my car, and I have gotten beeps a few times. I've started giving them the finger because I was like, why are they honking at me? And then I remembered that I had, but I'm also a Jersey driver, so like, take that as you will. Here, I was looking at a series of integrations that you can build into your SSO platform. That basically you have a user, logs in through your SSO platform, and automatically takes that login information and that token and sends it to some third party that you've set up with. And in this case, it was an NFT platform that keeps track of the NFTs that you misguidedly purchased. And it returns a list. These are the NFTs that you own. And they had two integrations. The first was just return a list and like present it on your profile. The second was limit who can access the application based on NFT ownership. And so both of them are pulling the same information from the third-party API. They're both sending your user ID number, your email to this third party and just saying, send me back a list of the NFTs they own. Sending the same information, getting the same information back. And I'm able, in theory, to add a new NFT to the list that's returning as the authenticating user. How bad is that? Well, it matters. In the first case, where I'm just listing the NFTs on my profile, it's not that big of a deal, right? Like, okay, maybe I get more, or in my mind, less clout for owning another NFT. But in the second case, where that's being used for access control, that very same finding is now a critical, right? Like, I can bypass functionality. And so in this case, we want to say, like, at the start is what is the worst thing that can happen, right? Quickly I have like 5 minutes? Awesome, perfect. So now I can go to the last use case, the last case study, because this is one that I used in my personal life. I recently bought a home, but prior to that I was living in an apartment, and I had to set up an alarm system. And you know, my parents' house had one of those like hardwired ADT systems from like the 90s, but we have, you know, ones now that you can set up yourself. And so I had to decide, how am I going to go about protecting myself and my house? And so I had to first ask, what am I protecting, right? Here I actually started with what are we looking at? I had to make an attack map and say, okay, I live in a second floor apartment. And so I have doors that I want to be aware of, but I also have windows, but I'm on the second floor. On one side of my apartment, there is a tall tree. I couldn't, but someone more athletic and, with greater agility than I could climb and get into my bedroom window. Meanwhile, my kitchen has a second floor window, but there's nothing there. Like, there's nothing to climb on, and it faces the other apartments, and so folks would notice if there's suddenly a ladder, let's say, to my kitchen. And so with this case, I can say, okay, I know what are the entry points I need to protect, but also what am I worried about going wrong? Am I worried about my things being stolen while I'm away? Yes. But also I work from home. Am I worried about someone breaking in at night? I, at the time, was a woman living alone. For the few women in the crowd, that is terrifying, especially at night. I may have called the police once when in reality, my bathroom toothpaste holder fell and clattered. I thought someone was breaking in. That was a really embarrassing 3 a.m. call. Anyway, at that point, that's where I can set my policies. If a door is opened at 3 in the morning, that's not me, right? And if someone's breaking into my house in the middle of the night, they're not there for my items. They are there for me. That's going to immediately call the police. Whereas if I'm not home and someone breaks in, or there's movement detected, I'd like to get a call first, take a look at what's going on, and then I'll call the police myself. I also had to consider, who am I actually worried about breaking in? I, fortunately, am not a target of professionals. I do not make nearly enough money for that to be the case, and I am not nearly well known enough for anyone to put significant resources into attacking my person. If I were, I'd probably want to replace my locks, not have like a quick set lock that the apartment provided. But that I can, by saying what are the threats I'm actually concerned about, I can prevent from going off the deep end and putting up steel walls, because I know that that's not going to be as likely for me as it is for, someone who makes 10 times my net worth and, is much more famous, let's say. So if you take anything away from this talk, other than the fact that I am usually an anxious mess, take these tips. Remember your scope. Map your attack surface and make sure you know what's in there. At the same time, don't worry about the threats outside of that scope. At least not unless you have gotten permission to start worrying about those threats. Then ask, what do I care about? What do I or my client care about? Is it a trophy target? Is it a hunch that I say, I think they may have this data, or this may be shared with something else? This is going to change on a case-by-case basis. This is not going to be standard. Even where you're talking to the same API, the use case may be different. And finally, what can go wrong? How can I achieve my end goal? If I want to exfiltrate PHI, what are the ways I can do it? There are going to be tons. Like I said, if there's a database that's being stored, I can get SQL injection. But also, if a doctor can input that PHI, I can probably read it too. Privask to a doctor. There's going to be several ways that you can do that. Think about what it is that you want to achieve. And so, with these steps, plus add the context to guide us. We don't just want to ask what can go wrong. We want to ask what can go wrong that is realistic and important. Otherwise, we're just going to start listing every horrible or not so horrible thing that could happen. That might just be me, but I hope it's also some of you. If you have any questions, feel free to come up to me afterwards. I'm happy to answer. Like I said, most of the time I do threat modeling formally, but I always make sure to do an informal threat model at the beginning of a pen test, and I found it really helpful. You may already do this unconsciously, so hopefully by making it a conscious effort, you can just step up your game a little bit. And thank you to you guys and to the awesome volunteers and organizers of the con, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your event.